Welcome to Vendetta Files, where mysterious cases' secrets come back into the light, unsolved crimes and forgotten stories leaves a trace.
The gas lamps of London cast long, flickering shadows down Oxford Street as I made my way towards Baker Street, the familiar chill of an autumn evening seeping into my bones. A peculiar stillness had settled over the city, a quiet tension that even the usual din of hansom cabs and distant cries could not quite dispel. It was late October of '93, and the air was thick with the scent of coal smoke and damp earth, a scent that, for all its commonness, seemed to carry a hint of something more sinister on this particular night. Upon entering our sitting room at 2121B, I found Holmes in his customary state of intense contemplation, a veritable fortress of thought. He was perched on the edge of his armchair, a magnifying glass clutched in his long artistic fingers, his gaze fixed upon a segment of the morning's Daily Telegraph. His pipe, long since extinguished, lay forgotten in an overflowing ashtray beside him, a testament to his single-minded absorption. "Watson," he murmured, without looking up, his voice a low thrum against the crackle of the dying fire. "You are rather late this evening. Did Mrs. Hudson's delightful, if somewhat overcooked, lamb stew keep you longer than anticipated? Or was it the fascinating discourse with young Mr. Davies regarding the peculiar rash he acquired during his recent travels to the East?" I removed my coat and hat, a familiar sigh escaping my lips. "Neither, Holmes, though I assure you, Mr. Davies's rash is a rather intriguing dermatological enigma. No, I was waylaid by a rather frantic Inspector Lestrade, who seemed to have a fresh, bewildering puzzle weighing heavily upon his broad shoulders." Holmes finally lowered the newspaper, his keen grey eyes, usually so sharp and piercing, now carrying a glint of something akin to grim satisfaction. "Indeed? And what fresh horror has graced the attention of Scotland Yard's finest, that he would seek out the modest counsel of a humble general practitioner?" "It is not a horror precisely," I corrected, pouring myself a measure of brandy. "More of an inexplicable disappearance, a rather prominent, if somewhat reclusive, gentleman of means. Mr. Alistair Finch, of Finch & Sons Shipping, a man of significant influence within the mercantile world, has vanished without a trace from his townhouse in Hanover Square." Holmes's expression remained impassive, but I detected a subtle tightening around his lips, a sign that his intellect had already begun to gnaw at the edges of the problem. "Finch, you say?" "A man known for his meticulous habits, if memory serves, a creature of routine punctuality almost to a fault. His sudden absence would indeed be a matter of considerable note." "Precisely," I affirmed, settling into my own chair opposite him. Lestrade was almost beside himself. "No forced entry, no struggle, no ransom note. It's as if the earth simply swallowed him whole in the dead of night. His servants, a butler and a small staff, swear they heard nothing unusual. He was last seen retiring to his study after a quiet dinner." "And what of the study, Watson? Any indications there? Disarray, a cryptic message?" Holmes's voice was now laced with an eagerness that always sent a shiver of anticipation down my spine. This was the Holmes I knew best, the mind awakening to the scent of a new chase. Nothing, according to Lestrade. Everything was in its proper place. The only oddity, if one could call it that, was a single fresh white rose placed on his desk. Finch was not known for his particular affection for flowers. A slow smile, cold and almost predatory, spread across Holmes's face. He picked up his pipe, examining the bowl as if it held the secrets of the universe. "A white rose, you say? How singular. Tell me, Watson, before we delve further into the intricacies of Mr. Finch's vanishing act, have you observed anything unusual about my current attire?" I glanced at him, perplexed. Holmes was dressed, as ever, in his dressing gown, a rather worn but comfortable garment of purple silk. "Unusual? Not particularly, Holmes. It is your usual evening ensemble, if a little dishevelled from your profound studies." He chuckled, a dry, reedy sound. "Ah, my dear Watson, you observe, but you do not deduce. Look closer. Consider the subtle nuances, the almost imperceptible alterations that speak volumes to a discerning eye." I leaned forward, scrutinizing his dressing gown, then his slippers, and finally his hands. It was then that I noticed it, a faint, almost invisible smudge of what appeared to be red clay just beneath the cuff of his right sleeve, near his wrist. His fingernails, usually impeccably clean, also bore a faint trace of the same reddish earth. "Holmes, you have been out," I exclaimed, a sudden realization dawning upon me, and not merely for a stroll around the block. That looks like the reddish clay found near the construction sites by the Thames, perhaps even further afield, towards the new underground railway extension. He clapped his hands together, a rare display of genuine delight. Excellent, Watson. Your powers of observation are improving by the day. Though I did not venture quite so far as the Thames, the clay, as you rightly identify, is indeed from a construction site, specifically the new sewer line being laid near Great Marlborough Street, not a quarter of a mile from here. And the time of my outing. I departed precisely at 2:15 this afternoon, and returned just before 4. What does that tell you? I considered this, my mind racing through the possibilities, a quick, purposeful excursion. And the clay. You must have been examining something at ground level, perhaps even digging a little, and given the time of year, the ground would be damp, making the clay stick readily. Precisely, my dear fellow. Holmes beamed. I was examining a rather curious fossil fragment unearthed by a workman, a vestige of a prehistoric creature, surprisingly well preserved. But my point, Watson, is not the fossil itself, but the journey. The very specific nature of the clay, the time of my absence, the slight, almost imperceptible scent of disinfectant that still clings to my jacket from the public thoroughfare I passed. All these seemingly trivial details, when combined, paint a clear picture of my activities. In much the same way, the disappearance of Mr. Alastair Finch, with its lack of visible struggle and that solitary white rose will, when viewed through the lens of meticulous observation and logical deduction, reveal a tapestry far more intricate than Lestrade can possibly imagine. He rose from his chair, a sudden burst of energy animating his lean frame. Come, Watson. It seems the night is young, and the secrets beneath Hanover Square are calling. A man does not simply vanish into thin air, nor does a rose bloom without a gardener. I grabbed my notebook, already feeling the familiar thrill of an impending adventure. Holmes was right. The game was afoot, and a formidable opponent, one who dealt in the subtle art of misdirection, had clearly laid their first move. My initial observations regarding the Finch case were, as usual, rudimentary. I had recorded the basic facts as relayed by Lestrade. Alastair Finch, 52, a bachelor, extremely wealthy, vanished from his secured townhouse. The time of disappearance was placed between 10:30 p.m., when his butler, Graves, confirmed he was in his study, and 7 a.m., when Graves returned to offer the morning coffee and found the room empty. This was the raw, unpolished ore. Holmes, I knew, would subject it to the crucible of his intellect and draw out the pure metal of truth. Hanover Square, Holmes mused as we hailed a cab, drawing his familiar deerstalker cap low over his brow, a location of considerable consequence and considerable discretion. Such streets do not often yield up their residents to mere chance, Watson. They are protected by iron railings, stout oak doors, and the unyielding etiquette of high society. Tell me more of this white rose. Did Lestrade examine it for scent? For provenance? He admitted that he had not, Holmes, dismissing it as a morbid flourish, perhaps left by a peculiar blackmailer or a theatrical burglar. Holmes snorted, a sound of profound intellectual disdain. The theatrical burglar is a concept invented by the sensation mongers of Fleet Street, not a reality faced by practical men. Every action has a precise motive, Watson, and in this case the rose is the singular exception to the otherwise perfect vacuum of clues. It suggests an emotional component, or perhaps a highly coded signature. The flower, its color, and its state of freshness are the first things we must ascertain. Our cab rattled swiftly through the deserted streets towards Mayfair. Holmes, who had lapsed into one of his profound silences, suddenly spoke, his eyes fixed on the retreating figure of an elderly man passing beneath a gas lamp. Observe that gentleman, Watson. The one in the well-cut, albeit slightly faded Chesterfield coat. What do you make of him? I strained my eyes. A respectable professional, surely. A solicitor or perhaps a retired surgeon. Walks with a slight, almost imperceptible drag of the right foot. Age about 65. Good, very good, Holmes conceded, tapping my knee. Now look at his collar. Do you see the fine dark dust clinging to the fold, particularly on the left side? That is coal dust, not the common grit of the street. And note the deep, habitual crease on the top of his left boot, the kind acquired not from walking, but from resting that foot upon a very specific surface for hours at a time. Finally, the sleeve of his coat. It is worn smooth near the elbow, the nap almost entirely gone, consistent with constant resting upon a hard surface. I frowned, bewildered. He works near a coal merchant, or perhaps a blacksmith. Holmes sighed, a sound of weary patience. No, Watson. He is a gentleman who spends his evenings 5 nights a week, playing whist in a room heated by a coal fire. The dust rises from the grate directly to the left of his usual chair. The crease on the boot is precisely where he hooks his right heel over the edge of the chair's wooden rung. The worn elbow rests consistently upon the table. He is not a solicitor, but Mr. Josiah Blackwood, a retired civil servant, whose sole remaining occupation is the pursuit of quiet social gambling at the Criterion Club. He is returning home, having lost, judging by the slight tremor in his hands, nearly all of his week's allowance. I stared at the retreating figure, then back at Holmes, profoundly impressed by the sheer scaffolding of logic he had erected from 3 particles of dust and a worn elbow. You never cease to amaze me, Holmes. But what has Mr. Blackwood to do with Mr. Finch? Nothing whatsoever, my dear fellow, he replied, settling back. But the power of observation, when correctly applied, should be as effective upon an unsuspecting passerby as upon a crime scene. It is merely a reminder that every man carries his entire history etched upon his person, and every room tells the story of its occupants. This power, Watson, is what Lestrade lacks, and what we must bring to bear upon Hanover Square. He tapped the window as the cab turned the corner, pulling up before a stately 3-story brick townhouse, its windows dark and forbidding. A single constable stood guard by the railings, looking utterly bored. The study, Watson, is where we begin. It is the last known location of the vanished man. And remember, the absence of a struggle is frequently more telling than its presence. It suggests a lack of surprise, an intruder known to the victim, or a departure by choice. But why would a man of Finch's financial stability and solitary habits choose to vanish, leaving a white rose in his wake? The flower elevates the case from a simple missing persons report to a matter of profound and deliberate deception. Come, let us go inside and see if the house is as silent as the grave, or if the walls themselves have a story to whisper into our ears. As we approached the door, Holmes paused, running his fingers lightly over the brass plate bearing the Finch name. He inhaled deeply. I detect the faint, cloying scent of cheap cigar smoke on the breeze, Watson. A peculiar odor for a house whose master was known to favor a costly Cuban variety. And that, my friend, is our first true inconsistency. The butler, Graves, a man whose face was a perfect mask of controlled but deep agitation, admitted us. The air inside the house was cold, and silence pressed in upon us like a physical weight. I had the distinct sensation that we were walking into a room still warm from the presence of a man who was no longer there. Graves, the butler, led us up the polished mahogany staircase, his spine rigidly straight, betraying nothing save for the minute, involuntary flexing of his jaw. The scent of cheap cigar smoke that Holmes had detected outside was noticeably fainter here in the main hall, suggesting the source was either very recent or confined to a specific area near the entrance. The study is at the rear of the house, gentlemen, Graves murmured, his voice desiccated and low like the rustle of old paper. Mr. Finch retired there shortly after 10:30. I presented the evening brandy and then left him. I saw no one, heard nothing, until I discovered the room empty this morning. Holmes made no reply, his eyes already scanning the landings, assessing the wear on the carpet, the placement of the sparse, heavy Victorian furniture. When we entered the study, I immediately saw what Lestrade had described, a chamber of meticulous, almost oppressive order. It was a handsome room, lined with dark, leather-bound books and heavy drapes that muffled the sounds of the city. A large, ornate walnut desk stood squarely in the center, and on its polished surface, lying next to a half-finished ledger, was the white rose. It was a perfect specimen, I noted, almost unnaturally so. It possessed a faint, sweet and distinctly exotic fragrance, not the common scent of a garden rose. Holmes approached it with the reverence one might show an ancient manuscript, lowering his nose delicately towards the petals. "Ah, the Niveus Fidelis, or the White Fidelity," he pronounced, straightening up. "A rare hybrid, Watson, requiring careful cultivation under glass. It is entirely scentless to the average person, but my hypersensitive olfactory nerves detect a residue of camphor and a very specific fertilizer. indicating it was recently brought from an expensive indoor collection. This is not a flower casually plucked from a garden. He then moved swiftly around the desk. His eyes, quick and predatory, swept across the surfaces, taking in details I would have utterly missed. He did not disturb anything unnecessarily, merely touching, inhaling, or using his glass. "No dust here, Graves, near the skirting board," Holmes noted, pointing to a section near the coal grate. "Suggests recent vigorous cleaning. But why only this section?" I am unsure, sir," the butler stammered, visibly discomfited by this sudden accusation of incomplete cleaning. "We follow a strict schedule." Holmes ignored him, moving past the bookshelf. "And note, Watson, the ledger here. It is open to the accounts for the Cypriot Holdings Limited, a dummy corporation, I believe, used by Mr. Finch for investments in the Eastern Mediterranean. See the last entry, dated yesterday, marked simply SA $5,000, a substantial sum and unusually vague." He then focused his attention on the fireplace. The grate was clean, but Holmes pointed towards a small, almost microscopic cluster of ash beneath the edge of the brass fender. "Look, Watson, these are not coal ashes. Too fine, too light, and they carry the distinct acrid smell of burnt paper. And not just any paper. See the tiny half-charred fragment here? It is a section of a cheap theatre program, probably from a second-rate establishment. A very distinct departure from Mr. Finch's known tastes in literature and entertainment, which ran exclusively towards classical music and philosophy. My mind was attempting to connect the pieces. A rare, camphored white rose, a vague $5,000 transfer to a Cypriot holding company, an exceptionally clean corner of the room, and a fragment of a burnt cheap theatre program. The combination was utterly baffling. Finch, the orderly, secretive shipping magnate, seemed to have been engaged in activities entirely contradictory to his public persona. A departure by choice, I speculated, scribbling furiously in my notebook. He met someone here, burnt a document relating to them, left the money, and then went out, perhaps willingly to meet the person who left the rose. Holmes was now kneeling by the heavy mahogany door, examining the lock with his lens. "An astute suggestion, Watson. But consider this. If he left willingly, why the secrecy? And more importantly," he paused, his gaze fixed on a tiny, shiny speck embedded in the dark wood of the doorframe, almost at floor level. He gently dislodged it with the tip of his penknife. "Graves, please bring me the lamp closer." Under the concentrated beam of the oil lamp, the speck resolved itself into a minute sliver of metallic alloy, silver-colored, with a peculiar serrated edge. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked, completely unable to identify the fragment. "It is a piece of a key blank, Watson," he announced, turning the tiny shard over in his palm. "A blank intended for cutting, not a finished key. And note its position. It was forced into the wood at an upward angle, the force applied from inside the room, pressing outward. Furthermore, look at the dust here." He brushed his hand against the lower corner of the door. Not the fine London grime, but pulverized brick dust, as if a heavy object had been violently dragged along the wall near the frame, scraping the plaster. He stood up, his face suddenly alight with grim excitement. "We have been misled, Watson. The perfect order of this room is a lie, a carefully constructed stage set. Mr. Finch did not leave willingly. He was removed. The lock was not picked. It was tampered with, possibly damaged by a forced opening or a hurried relocking. The rose is not a signature, but a diversion. And the true clue, the tiny, insignificant sliver of key blank, suggests that whoever removed him went to extraordinary lengths to ensure the door appeared secured from the outside, even damaging their own tools in the process." The silence in the study seemed to deepen. Graves looked ashen. The meticulous disappearance was now revealed to be a meticulously staged disappearance. Mr. Finch had not walked out. He had been forcibly escorted or perhaps carried out. The mystery had deepened considerably, and the perfect suspect, the man who simply chose to vanish, had just dissolved into thin air. Inspector Lestrade arrived shortly after our discovery, his face etched with a mix of exhaustion and sour skepticism. He was shown the tiny serrated fragment of the key blank and listened to Holmes's crisp, almost surgical explanation regarding the staging of the study. "A forced removal, you say, Holmes? Against all appearances?" Lestrade grumbled, adjusting his necktie. "But why the effort to make it look voluntary? If they were strong enough to carry him off, why waste time making the room tidy?" Precisely, Lestrade, Holmes said, his voice crackling with impatience. The effort expended on the misdirection is exactly what interests me. A simple murder leaves a corpse in a mess. This leaves a vacuum and a beautifully composed flower. It points to an enemy who deals not in brute force, but in reputation and legal vulnerability. Whoever took Finch needed the public, and perhaps the police, to believe he had fled, leaving his considerable assets unclaimed or in administrative limbo. Assets, Lestrade repeated, suddenly interested. That brings us to the first name on our list, a Mr. Elias Thorne, a bitter rival of Finch's in the shipping trade. Thorne's company was nearly ruined 2 years ago by a sharp maneuver Finch pulled with the Suez Canal transit fees. Thorne publicly swore he would see Finch sail into oblivion. He has motive, certainly. An excellent point of departure, Holmes agreed, already moving towards the bookshelves once more. A publicly known enemy often serves as the perfect scapegoat, the obvious suspect intended to draw the eye away from the true culprit. Nonetheless, we must follow the obvious thread first. Have you ascertained Thorne's whereabouts last night? He has a cast-iron alibi, Lestrade admitted grudgingly. Dining with the Lord Mayor at the Mansion House until midnight, too public an event for a direct attack. However, there is another line of inquiry, one that Graves the butler was reluctant to mention. Lestrade lowered his voice conspiratorially. Mr. Finch, despite his reputation as a cold recluse, has been involved, rather discreetly, with a young woman, a Miss Cordelia Vane. She is an actress, or perhaps an opera singer, depending on who you ask. Known for her expensive tastes and rather volatile temperament, they had a violent row 3 weeks ago, overheard by Graves concerning money and a perceived slight. She was apparently demanding a significant settlement to leave London. Miss Vane, Holmes repeated, his fingers trailing over the spine of a volume of Schopenhauer. The volatility, the demands for money, the theatrical profession, these elements fit well with the staging of The White Rose and the $5,000 transfer to the Cypriot Holding Company. Love and finance, Watson, remain the two great engines of crime. Thorne offers us financial retribution. Miss Vane offers us passionate, possibly complicated financial coercion. Let us pursue the romantic entanglement first. It is less likely to have a cast-iron alibi than a dinner with the Lord Mayor. Before departing for Miss Vane's residence in Chelsea, Holmes insisted on one final methodical examination of the room's periphery. He ignored the furniture and focused solely on the structural details, the moldings, the thickness of the walls, and the floorboards beneath the heavy rug. The key blank tells us that the removal was done quickly, with an emphasis on immediate security, Holmes explained, tapping his cane on the floor near the large stone fireplace. But the pulverized brick dust, Watson, that is our most valuable piece of evidence so far. It suggests a significant abrasion against the wall near the floor, not a body being dragged, which would leave fabric fibers, but perhaps a heavy piece of equipment, or more likely, a piece of stone or masonry being moved. He knelt down again, pushing aside the thick Persian rug. The floorboards beneath were dark aged oak, seemingly pristine. But Holmes's keen eyes detected the faintest line, a straight, almost hairline fracture in the wood, extending from the side of the fireplace towards the wall behind the desk. It was virtually invisible, a detail only revealed by the angle of the lamplight. "Look here, Watson," he whispered, pointing with his magnifying glass. The scratch of a sharp metal edge consistently applied. This rug has been moved, and moved repeatedly. And beneath the rug, we find a professional repair, a section of the floorboards recently replaced and stained to match the old wood. The workmanship is excellent, intended to deceive. I stared at the faint scar in the wood, my excitement mounting. This was the kind of hidden inconsistency that Holmes thrived upon. A secret compartment, Holmes. Perhaps a safe hidden beneath the floor? No, Watson. Safes are designed for concealment, not movement. A safe would be fixed. This suggests a mechanism that moves. Given the proximity to the massive stone fireplace, I postulate something far more elaborate. A hidden passage, perhaps, or a chamber concealed within the very structure of the house, recently accessed, which accounts for the brick dust we found. Holmes stood, a slow, grim smile returning to his face. The stage is set, Watson, not just for a disappearance, but for the performance of a secret life. Finch was not simply a man of shipping. He was a man with a heavy secret, a secret that demanded its own hidden entrance and its own special security. And this hidden mechanism was used to either take him out or to bring someone in who did the removing. We shall, however, maintain the pretense of pursuing Miss Vane. The villain, whoever he is, will be expecting us to follow the obvious trail of financial and romantic trouble. We shall afford him that small comfort. The fog, that familiar noxious blanket of London, had begun to roll in earnest by the time our cab reached Chelsea. Miss Cordelia Vane occupied a small but exquisitely appointed flat near the river, a location that spoke volumes of a lady with aspirations beyond the stage. We were admitted by a nervous maid and ushered into a parlour dominated by velvet drapes and an overabundance of scented candles. Miss Vane herself was a striking figure, possessing the kind of dramatic beauty that faded quickly when stripped of the footlights. She was pale, dressed in a black silk tea-gown, and affected an air of profound, if slightly performative, distress. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice possessing the deep, modulated tones of a trained contralto. "This is quite dreadful. Alistair—" "Mr. Finch. Gone? I only read of it in the afternoon papers." Holmes's eyes, however, were not on her face, but scanning the small, cluttered room. They rested for a moment on a silver-framed photograph of Alistair Finch on the mantelpiece, then moved quickly to the piano, where several sheets of music lay scattered. A dreadful affair indeed. "Miss Vane," Holmes said smoothly, seating himself without invitation, "we understand your relationship with Mr. Finch was intense. A bond of considerable passion, perhaps mingled with some financial arrangements." She stiffened, her distress hardening into resentment. "Mr. Finch was a generous patron and a friend. Yes, we had our disagreements. What artistic temperament does not clash with the cold practicality of a financier? Our last disagreement was over a minor investment I wished to make. Nothing that would lead to this, the subject of the investment?" Holmes pressed, his voice deceptively mild. "A small theatrical venture, a new play in the East End," she replied, waving a dismissive hand. "He thought it beneath my talent. He was perhaps too protective of my reputation." "And the money, Miss Vane?" I interjected, consulting my notes. "Did he promise you a settlement? Perhaps £5,000? Miss Vane's composure broke for a fraction of a second. Her eyes flickered away. "He was negotiating an annuity, yes. Something substantial enough to secure my future. That was his character. He was generous but meticulous. He would never simply vanish and leave his affairs in disarray." Holmes suddenly leaned forward, not towards Miss Vane, but towards a small decorative table beside her armchair. On it lay a half-eaten box of French bonbons and a small silver sewing thimble seemingly forgotten. "This is a handsome thimble, Miss Vane," Holmes remarked, picking it up. "An unusual presentation of sterling silver. Do you occupy yourself with embroidery?" "A little," she replied, visibly confused by the sudden shift in topic. "I find needlework calming after a strenuous rehearsal." Holmes turned the thimble over in his fingers, his thumb covering most of the surface. He then slipped it into his waistcoat pocket with a speed that suggested he did not wish me, or anyone else, to see a specific detail. It was an act of deliberate concealment, an instant recognition of significance that he immediately hoarded for private consideration. "Tell me, Miss Vane," he continued, returning to the subject of Finch with effortless transition, "did Mr. Finch ever speak to you about his house? About any peculiar habits? Did he ever mention that large stone fireplace in his study?" She looked relieved to be on safer ground. "Only that it was ugly and that the room was poorly lit. He was a creature of habit, Mr. Holmes. He had the same schedule, the same meal times. He was obsessed with order. That is why I know he would never simply walk out on his business." "Indeed," Holmes murmured, rising to signal the close of the interview. "An obsession with order can be a dangerous thing, Miss Vane. It often means a person is compensating for profound disorder hidden beneath the surface. Good day to you." As we walked back towards the cab, I turned to Holmes, my brow furrowed with confusion and curiosity. "The thimble, Holmes? What possible relevance can a silver thimble have to the disappearance of a shipping magnate? And why did you hide it?" Holmes merely smiled, a thin, knowing expression that irritated me deeply. "It has everything to do with the case, Watson, but nothing to do with Miss Vane. She is a woman obsessed with her future assets, not with past revenge. She is a distraction, a perfectly logical yet false lead, placed there to satisfy the average police mind. But the thimble—" "The thimble," Holmes interrupted, lowering his voice, "is not Miss Vane's. It is too worn, Watson, and the size is too large for the elegant hands of an opera singer. It belongs to a woman whose hands know hard, repetitive labor. Furthermore," he paused, glancing back at the townhouse, "it is engraved, though faintly, with a single highly suggestive letter H. But the true significance lies in what the thimble contained, or rather, the residue it carried. I only showed it to Miss Vane to observe her lack of genuine recognition, cementing my theory that she is innocent of Finch's removal." He paused again, his expression turning serious. "The thimble carried a trace of gold dust, Watson, the finest kind, only used in extremely specialized crafting, perhaps gilding or jewelry repair. And more importantly, embedded in the rim, beneath the thin layer of dust, was a minute fragment of the same reddish-brown clay we saw upon my own cuff, but combined with a very specific mineral residue I instantly recognized from my geological studies. Clay? Like the construction site? No, this clay is different, Watson. It is a very specific type of rich, mineral-laden earth, found only in the soil beneath the foundations of certain old London buildings, often utilized in structural repairs or tunneling. This, combined with the gold dust and the H initial, suggests that our forced removal was not done by a simple criminal, but by someone connected to a hidden trade, and, crucially, someone connected to a deep, dark place beneath the city, a place where the earth is seldom disturbed. The silver thimble, an object of domestic labor, is the only link we have to the actual culprit, and I shall not present it to Lestrade until I have fully fathomed the network it represents. The game, my friend, is becoming deliciously complex. The visit to Miss Vane did little to assuage the growing tension between us. Holmes's deliberate secrecy regarding the thimble, a move entirely characteristic of his method when nearing a critical breakthrough, left me feeling like an apprentice kept in the dark about the master's technique. We returned to Baker Street, the silence in the cab thick with my unasked questions. "Do not fret, Watson," Holmes remarked, sensing my pique as he stoked the sitting-room fire back to life. "It is not that I distrust your discretion, but a complex mechanism like a clock must have all its parts assembled before its purpose can be divined, and the significance of the thimble, the gold dust, and the deep clay is so remote from the perceived facts of the case that even your excellent common sense would reject it prematurely." Just as Holmes was about to launch into a further esoteric explanation, a mud-splattered messenger arrived, bearing a frantic note from Lestrade. The message was terse and chilling. "A second development at Finch's. Financial catastrophe. Come at once." We were instantly back in the hansom cab, retracing our route to Hanover Square. The development, as Lestrade explained in hushed, anxious tones upon our arrival, was not one of violence, but of financial ruin. It seems Mr. Finch's disappearance has triggered a full administrative review of his shipping firm. "Finch and Sons," Lestrade whispered, gesturing towards a stern-faced gentleman from the Bank of England who was conferring with a solicitor by the front door. A preliminary audit this afternoon revealed that the Cypriot Holdings account, where the £5,000 was transferred, was not a personal investment as we assumed. It was, in fact, the final emergency safeguard of Finch and Sons, a fund established to cover a very specific, catastrophic liability. The solicitor, a thin man named Mr. Harrington, confirmed the grim news. The entire fund, approximately $200,000, has been systematically liquidated over the past 18 months, culminating in that final $5,000 transfer last night. Mr. Finch's company is now essentially insolvent, leveraged to the breaking point by unknown external forces. If he does not reappear within 48 hours to sign a critical set of documents, the firm will face immediate receivership, ruining hundreds of smaller investors. The stakes had suddenly soared from a simple missing person case to an economic tragedy. This was not the work of a spurned lover or a vengeful rival. This was a calculated long-term financial assassination. "This changes the geometry of the crime entirely," Holmes muttered, his eyes distant, fixed upon a plane far removed from the agitated people around him. The staging of the voluntary disappearance, the tidy study, the vague Cypriot transfer, it was all designed to buy the culprit precisely 48 hours of clean, untraceable time. He pulled out his notebook and began rapidly sketching. The liquidation of $200,000 takes time and exceptional access. It was an inside job, orchestrated over many months. The person who took Finch needed him silent and absent just long, enough for the financial collapse to be legally attributed to his flight, and not to their own embezzlement. Holmes now began to exhibit the strange, restless energy that always preceded a profound deductive leap. He paced the drawing room, rubbing his hands together, occasionally running his fingers through his hair. Consider the structure, Watson. The secret moving floor near the fireplace, allowing quick, silent ingress and egress. The gold dust-carrying thimble belonging to H, linked to deep old clay. And now the meticulous, drawn-out financial sabotage. How do these three threads, the secret passage, the woman H and gold, and the financial ruin, weave together? He stopped abruptly, his gaze settling on the wall opposite the drawing-room fireplace, directly above where the study was located. The location, Watson, Hanover Square. It stands upon some of the oldest, deepest foundations in London. What trade was once predominant in this precise square centuries ago? Not shipping, but gilding, jewelry, and the ancient crafts that demanded proximity to the aristocracy, and crucially, access to deep cellars and tunnels for secrecy. He pointed to the floor, then back to the thimble clue. The gold dust and the ancient clay are not a random association. They imply that the secret passage leads not merely into an adjoining room, but downwards into a pre-existing substructure, perhaps a forgotten network of tunnels or vaults used by Finch's ancestors, who may have been involved in the lucrative gold trade. The woman H is therefore likely tied to this ancient secret location, possibly running an illicit trade or workshop there now. And Finch? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, finally seeing the structure of his reasoning. Finch was not simply kidnapped, Watson, Holmes declared, his voice ringing with conviction. He was taken down. He was silenced not by a blow, but by a legal mechanism that required him to appear to have fled. He was kept alive, very likely imprisoned in that substructure, forced to reveal his final access codes, or simply held until the financial deadline passes. The final $5,000 transfer was not a random payout, but a deliberate signal to the organization controlling the deep network, confirming that the last stage of the financial scheme was complete. We must descend, Watson. The answers are not in the drawing rooms, but beneath the very soil of Hanover Square. The gravity of the financial revelation had injected a new urgency into Holmes's movements. He excused himself abruptly from Lestrade, offering a vague promise of following a minor professional acquaintance of Finch's, and dragged me back to Baker Street. There he shed his outdoor clothes and donned a suit of deep black cloth, the color of midnight, and armed himself with a dark lantern and a selection of thin, finely wrought instruments designed for delicate lockwork. "We return to Hanover Square tonight, Watson, and we return alone," he announced, his eyes glittering with the fierce, focused light of intellectual engagement. Lestrade, with his retinue of heavy-footed constables, would alert our quarry instantly. We need silence, shadows, and the element of surprise. The mechanism is there. The gold dust carrier H is connected to it, and the clock of Finch's finances is ticking toward a spectacular crash. Our goal is simple. Locate the aperture and, failing that, set a trap that will draw out the person responsible for its operation. We arrived at the townhouse just after 2 in the morning. The constable on duty, a drowsy fellow, was easily circumvented by a carefully worded note ostensibly from Lestrade, instructing him to patrol the rear alley for unusual activity. Within minutes, Holmes had applied a specially prepared solvent to the lock of the front door, allowing us entry with only the faint click of the tumbler. Back in the study, the room was now a canvas of shadows, illuminated only by the focused beam of Holmes's dark lantern. He immediately discarded the desk and the ledger, concentrating solely on the stone fireplace and the faint line he had discovered beneath the rug. "The key blank suggests hurried entry or exit," Holmes murmured, running his fingers along the mortar between the bricks of the hearth. "The pulverized brick dust suggests a heavy, cumbersome movement. It is unlikely to be a simple counterweighted panel, Watson. It must be something more robust, something that seals perfectly to avoid detection, likely controlled by a discreet lever or catch." He spent a full 30 minutes examining the perimeter of the fireplace and the floorboards. I stood guard, the heavy service revolver Lestrade had loaned me feeling cold and useless in my hand. Then a low squeak of surprise escaped Holmes's lips. He pointed the lantern at the thick ornamental iron grating covering the air vent set low into the floor beside the hearth. "The draught, Watson, feel it. It is entirely too strong for a mere ventilation grill. This is the source of the ventilation for the tunnel or vault below." He inserted a thin hooked probe into the side of the iron grating. With a tiny, almost inaudible metallic snap, the grill popped open, revealing not a dusty pipe but a small copper lever set into the masonry below. "Observe, Watson," Holmes whispered, a note of triumph in his voice. "The control mechanism itself, hidden in plain sight, disguised as a common air intake. The culprit had merely to kneel, flick the lever, and the stone would shift." Holmes pressed the lever. There was a low, heavy groan, the sound of tons of stone shifting on oiled tracks. The entire left side of the fireplace, hearth and all, slid silently inward and down, revealing a sheer black shaft descending into the earth. The rush of cold, damp, earthy air that met us was powerful, carrying the unmistakable scent of the ancient clay Holmes had detected on the thimble. The silence that followed was broken only by the frantic beat of my own heart. A private tunnel, Watson, built long ago, likely during a period of civil unrest or perhaps smuggling, and maintained in perfect secrecy by the Finch family for generations, Holmes breathed, shining his lantern into the darkness. "But we cannot simply descend. That would be walking into their snare. We must force them to come to us." Holmes turned his attention back to the study. He pulled a small silver whistle from his pocket, a silent dog whistle, and then retrieved a tiny vial of a volatile chemical from his field kit. He located the telephone receiver on the desk and rapidly composed a brief, untraceable telegram. "We have two goals, Watson," he explained, working with furious speed. "First, we send an urgent message to Thorne, the shipping rival, stating that Finch has returned and is signing the final insolvency documents at dawn. This will create a public panic among the investors, and more importantly, put immense traceable pressure on the system the culprit relies on. Second, we must force H to reveal herself here." He uncorked the vial and poured a single, pungent drop onto the silk scarf he had been wearing earlier that evening, then placed the scarf deliberately on the arm of Finch's desk chair. "This compound, Watson, is Hydrastis canadensis, a rare, almost scentless alkaloid I keep for forensic work. It is harmless, but it has one remarkable property. It is highly attractive to gold and silversmiths who often use a related compound in their work. It is an olfactory signature only a gold worker would subconsciously recognize as out of place in a drawing room." Holmes then extinguished his lantern, plunging the room into absolute blackness. He drew me back behind the heavy velvet drapes near the window. "Our quarry, H, who is clearly maintaining the tunnel network and possibly holding Finch, will likely return through this passage to check the status of the room before dawn, perhaps to retrieve a vital document or ensure the staging is still intact. The scent of the alkaloid will draw their attention to the scarf, and the message about Thorne will confirm that their window of opportunity is closing. They will have to act. We wait now, Watson, motionless, silent, and ready to spring the trap the moment the secret aperture is used again." I settled in beside him, peering through the heavy folds of the curtain into the suffocating darkness of the study. The chill air from the open passage filled the room, and I could hear nothing but the anxious thumping of my own pulse. I knew that at any moment the massive stone fireplace might groan again, and from the black throat of the earth, the true conspirator would emerge. The silence in the study was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket broken only by the faintest tremor of the London Underground, running its late-night course far beneath our feet. Minutes stretched into an eternity. I was acutely aware of the cold, musty air rising from the open aperture and the overwhelming tension radiating from Holmes, who stood as still as the velvet drapes that concealed us. Then the low groan returned, not the sound of the lever being pressed, but the slow, heavy grind of the massive stone slab moving back into position. Our quarry was emerging. A shaft of weak light, quickly shielded by a dark cloak, appeared in the opening. A figure, slight and agile, swiftly scaled the short internal staircase that must exist within the wall. The person paused, taking an audible deep breath of the study's air, likely to check for the presence of others. It was then, as the figure moved into the center of the room, that the trap was sprung. Holmes did not rely on brute force. He merely gave a short, sharp blast on the silver dog whistle. The high-pitched, inaudible sound served only to disorient the intruder for a critical half-second. "Halt!" Holmes commanded, stepping out from behind the drapes, his dark lantern clicking open to cast a blinding, narrow beam directly onto the face of the intruder. The figure gasped, raising a slender arm to shield its eyes. It was a woman, slight of build, dressed in dark, functional clothing, her hands blackened with grease and clay. But the face, framed by loose, dark hair, was not that of a common criminal. It possessed a striking, fierce intelligence. She clutched a leather satchel and a small antique hammer. "Mrs. Hudson's niece, I believe, if I am not mistaken?" Holmes asked, his voice calm yet carrying the cutting edge of victory. The woman stared, her eyes wide with shock. How did you know?" she whispered, abandoning the attempt to flee. "Indeed. Allow me to introduce Miss Hester Finch, Mr. Alistair Finch's unacknowledged half-sister," Holmes announced, turning slightly towards me. Alistair Finch's grandfather, the founder of the shipping empire, was also a secret gold refiner and jeweler, using this very substructure beneath Hanover Square to ply his trade, far from the prying eyes of the excisemen. He left this vault, not to Alistair's legitimate line, but to the illegitimate progeny, the hidden Finches, who maintained the secret trade and the tunnels for generations. "You, Miss Finch, are the last of that line." Hester Finch lowered the hammer, her shoulders slumping. "Alistair, he found out about us, about the vault, about my family's inherited claim. He threatened to expose the tunnels, destroy the vault, and have us all arrested for operating outside the guilds. The intricate web of deception." "Watson," Holmes continued, his light playing across the study. "It began with the 200,000 liquidation. Miss Finch, utilizing her inherited knowledge of the house's structure, did not simply take the money. She used her connections in the secretive gold and banking communities to systematically short her brother's shipping company over the course of 18 months, using his own assets as collateral. She was not a burglar, but a financial assassin." He gestured to the desk. "The white fidelity rose, Watson." Miss Finch knew Alistair had a weak heart. "It is the known symbol of the White Mutineers, a 17th-century group of underground gold refiners who signed their transactions with this specific flower. It was a morbid warning, a signature from the hidden Finches, reminding him that his life was in their hands, deep beneath the ground he stood upon." "And the thimble?" I finally asked, the whole structure of the case snapping into place. "The thimble was the absolute confirmation," Holmes explained. "It was indeed marked H, and it contained gold dust and the deep clay residue, which, upon closer inspection, I realized was mixed with cinnabar, a mineral historically used in the chemical refinement of gold. The thimble was dropped by Hester when she last exited the tunnel after removing her brother. It was a simple object of domestic industry, yet it spoke volumes of her true occupation down here. "I needed the money," Hester said, her voice strained but firm. "Alistair was cutting off the final payments my mother had received for years to keep our secret. He wanted to claim the vault's contents, which are legally mine. I had to silence him just long enough for the company to collapse, allowing me to step in with the necessary liquidity from the vault's gold and legally seize control of the firm, preventing the ruin he was orchestrating. The £5,000 transfer marked SA, Holmes concluded. Not South Africa or standard account, high but sub-aperture. It was the final, coded payment to a hired accomplice, not Mr. Thorne, who was too obvious, but to Graves, the butler, who supplied the cheap cigar smoke for the initial misdirection and helped you secure the lock after you removed your brother. He was the one who tampered with the lock using the key blank to simulate a hurried external resecuring. As if on cue, a loud clatter came from the hall. Lestrade and a contingent of constables, alerted by the faint blast of the dog whistle that they had, to their immense irritation barely heard, burst into the study, led by the bewildered figure of Graves. "Graves, you are under arrest," Lestrade bellowed, momentarily distracted from the elegant woman standing by the fireplace. "Mr. Finch, I presume, is alive and well, though heavily sedated, in the vault beneath us," Holmes informed Lestrade, ignoring the butler's struggles. "Miss Finch, you will lead the inspector down. I trust you have maintained the safety of the aperture. Your elaborate attempt to frame your brother as a runaway bankrupt has failed. The crime here is not disappearance, but coercion and grand larceny." The sight of the small, intelligent woman who had orchestrated a complete financial collapse and a structural manipulation worthy of a master engineer was quite staggering. The mystery was solved, yet the human story, the desperate fight for an ancestral inheritance waged in the dark tunnels beneath Mayfair, was unexpectedly poignant. The subsequent hours were a whirlwind of official commotion. Alistair Finch was recovered from the subterranean vault, found exactly as Holmes predicted, heavily sedated but otherwise unharmed, laid upon a rudimentary cot in a chamber, filled with antique assaying equipment and chests of gold bullion. Lestrade and his men, astonished by the sheer audacity of the hidden tunnel and the complexity of the crime, worked tirelessly to secure the aperture and catalogue the evidence in the vault below. Graves, the butler, was quickly exposed by Holmes's pointed questioning, crumbling under the weight of his calculated duplicity and admitting his role in securing the lock and acting as an informant for Hester Finch. I watched Holmes as he calmly directed the proceedings, his earlier nervous energy replaced by a cool, almost detached exhaustion. He was like a master craftsman, resting after the completion of an impossibly intricate piece of machinery. The sheer elegance of the solution, connecting a rare flower, a speck of clay, a financial crash and a concealed passage to a desperate woman fighting for her birthright, left me breathless with admiration. The revelation that the Finch family's respectable shipping empire was founded upon a hidden trade of illicit gold refining centuries old was the final, staggering piece of the puzzle. It explained Alistair Finch's obsessive secrecy and Hester's inherited knowledge of the house's structural secrets. The secrets beneath Hanover Square were literally the physical and moral foundations of the family fortune. Later that morning, as the first grey light of dawn broke over Baker Street, casting cold, dusty beams across our sitting room, I found myself compelled to return to the key component I had dismissed, the sheer brilliance of Holmes's final trap. It was not just the deduction, Holmes, I remarked, stirring my tea. It was the deployment. You not only knew who did it, but you knew when and where she would return. The use of the Hydrastis canadensis, the goldsmith's lure, coupled with the telegram rumor about the insolvency papers, it was a masterpiece of applied psychology. Holmes accepted the compliment with a languid wave of his hand, already engrossed in an obscure monograph on comparative tobacco ash. A criminal mind, Watson, especially one as organized and methodical as Miss Finch's, can only operate within the parameters of its own system. She was maintaining the illusion of a voluntary flight to gain the maximum financial advantage. Therefore, she had to ensure the stage setting remained undisturbed until the deadline passed. My telegram about Thorne ruined her timing. It forced her to come above ground out of her fortress, convinced that a vital element of her plan had been compromised and needed immediate rectification. And the alkaloid. The lure was merely insurance, Holmes clarified, tapping the cover of his book. It was a subconscious draw. A professional jeweler or refiner has a certain familiarity with those aromatic chemicals. The unfamiliar scent of the Hydrastis would be an irritant, a minor professional distraction, causing her to pause at the desk, the central point of the staged disappearance, just long enough for me to spring the whistle and the lantern. It was, as you term it, a piece of strategic stage management designed to guarantee a clean capture without violence. I sighed, shaking my head. The most astonishing element for me remains that tiny piece of key blank and the thimble. Those were the two sole physical clues that countermanded all the intentional misdirection. The rose, the tidy room, the plausible suspects. Anyone else would have followed Lestrade's path straight to Miss Vane or Mr. Thorne and been utterly lost in the fog of secondary evidence. The true artist of crime, Watson, is not the one who makes the most noise, but the one who creates the most perfect silence, Holmes observed, finally looking up, his gaze sharp and clear. Miss Finch understood that the absence of clues, the perfect neatness, would itself become a clue to me. But she could not erase the minuscule traces of her own world, the clay of her hidden tunnels, the dust of her hidden trade. The little things, my friend, are invariably the most important. They are the fixed points in a spinning world of deception. I took a final warm sip of my tea, feeling the pleasant ache of intellectual fatigue. The fog of uncertainty that had enveloped the case had entirely lifted. leaving behind a crisp, undeniable clarity. I realized that my role was not just to document the case, but to perpetually marvel at the extraordinary mind next to me, a mind capable of constructing the complex reality from fragments others discarded as refuse. The sun, now fully risen, streamed through the windows of 221B, illuminating the perpetual chaos of Holmes's mantelpiece and the stacks of unsorted papers that constituted his filing system. The previous night's adventure had concluded not with a bang, but with the weary thud of a prison door closing and the solemn legal processes now winding their way through the courts. Alistair Finch, though safe, faced the daunting task of untangling the financial Gordian knot his half-sister had tied, while Hester Finch, the brilliant gold refiner, faced the prospect of many years within the walls of Holloway Jail. I finished my second cup of tea, my notebook lying closed beside me, the final entry of the Secrets Beneath Hanover Square recorded. I felt the familiar, pleasant exhaustion that always accompanies the successful resolution of a complex case, a mental fatigue coupled with a deep satisfaction in the triumph of logic over wickedness. Holmes, having completed his perusal of the monograph, now turned his attention to a small, wooden case containing a selection of hypodermic needles. He began polishing them with scrupulous care. The change in his focus, from the profound financial and architectural complexity of the Finch case to the simple maintenance of his private vices, was jarring but entirely characteristic. "It is a pity, Watson," he murmured without looking up, "that a mind as fiercely acute as Miss Finch's should be utterly wasted upon the sordid necessity of crime. Her ability to operate a complex financial conspiracy while simultaneously maintaining a secret tunnel and a clandestine workshop argues for a genius that might have rivaled the great minds of the Royal Society." "A genius tragically misapplied, certainly," I agreed, watching his long fingers work over the steel. "But you cannot deny, Holmes, that the motivation, the preservation of her family's claim, however illegitimate, against her avaricious brother, lends a certain tragic dignity to the affair. She did not kill him. She merely put him out of the way long enough to effect a grand seizure of power. A distinction without a legal difference, my friend," Holmes retorted, replacing a needle in its case with a snap. "Though morally I concede the point. It is often the case that the greatest crimes are committed not by monsters, but by people struggling against the crushing weight of circumstance, or in this case, the anachronistic laws governing inheritance and trade secrets." He rose and crossed to the window, gazing out at the familiar traffic of Baker Street. His expression, usually so animated by the chase, was now one of profound melancholy. It was the look of a man who had expended his energy and was now grappling with the inevitable boredom that follows intense intellectual stimulation. "The world is a duller place today. Watson," he stated, turning back, "the structure of the Hanover Square mystery, the perfect staging, the deep historical roots, the sheer ingenuity of the substructure, was a rare treat. We have returned Miss Finch to the custody of the law, saved a great many small investors from ruin, and uncovered a piece of forgotten London history. But what remains for the mind now? The pursuit itself is the only reward. The capture is merely the anticlimax." He picked up the small battered violin from its case and tucked it under his chin, drawing the bow across the strings in a long, mournful chord. It was his usual reaction to the abatement of intellectual pressure, a recourse to the soothing balm of music. "You speak as though no other villain exists in this great city," I challenged him lightly. "Oh, there are villains aplenty, Watson," he replied, drawing another, more complex phrase from the instrument. "But they are by and large pedestrian villains. The brute who strikes with a blunt instrument, the schemer whose ledger sheets reveal his crimes at a glance. They offer no complexity, no elegant deception to engage the higher faculties." He lowered the violin slightly, fixing me with a penetrating look. "Mark my words, Watson. The true joy of detection lies not in the arrest but in the reconstruction. To take the scattered fragments, a piece of burnt theatre program, the scent of hydrastis, the serrated edge of a key blank, and reassemble the perfect sequence of events, that is the triumph. We were able to read the true narrative written in the dust and the dark, a language invisible to the coarser mind of Lestrade." He gave a final, resonant pluck of the strings. The world, my dear fellow, is full of people who observe but do not see, who hear but do not listen. Our task is to see and to listen, to notice the 2-inch rift in the commonplace that points to the extraordinary. Now, if you would be so kind as to fetch my Persian slipper. I believe I placed the pipe tobacco in the toe. We shall put this financial conspiracy behind us. I perceive by the faint, distinctive aroma clinging to the lining of the cab I used this morning. A new case regarding a lost pet and a possible poisoning in Regent's Park. A trifle. And no doubt, but one must maintain the edge. He settled back into his armchair, drawing a deep, contented breath as the scent of strong shag tobacco filled the room. The secrets beneath Hanover Square were finally at rest, and the mind of Sherlock Holmes, ever restless, was already turning its gaze toward the next enigma.